Welcome. Today we bring coverage of an event influencing the global economy and its operations in all nations, businesses, and homes. 2026 begins following widespread global conflicts and events. Subsurface tensions persist as alliances formed in recent human history enter another period of strain. International conditions show increased tension. Confidence from prior decades has receded, giving way to uncertainty and suspicion. Major powers now prepare for direct competition and unapologetic indifference to human life in the name of pragmatism. Across several years and quieter decades, industry, wealthy individuals, think tanks, and conservative groups developed a strategy inside Washington power structures. Confidential drafting and closed discussions produced a plan now influencing current global conditions. The strategy links sanctions against Russia, resource competition with China, and intervention in Venezuela. Decision-makers chose actions and targets through measured assessment away from the overall public. The stated objective centers on economic dominance through force. The United States is pursuing control over resources, technology, and capital, limiting rival participation. The Western fortress presents a scenario of Western isolation and perceived might maintained through trade barriers and coercive capacity against rivals and allies alike. If allowed to proceed by the people's representatives and presidents, this course of action seeks to reconfigure global governance structures. Its outcomes and risks will persist over generational timelines.
Today, the people must ask, is this fortress a shield protecting Western prosperity, or is it a cage trapping us in a cycle of confrontation and isolation? The plan seeks to isolate U.S. adversaries and to force rising powers and smaller nations to choose between access to the American market or alignment with Russia and China. The outcome carries direct consequences for global trade, foreign relations, and human lives. The situation functions as a trade dispute and an economic ultimatum affecting roughly half the world's population. Billions of lives and livelihoods will face the outcomes as their governments confront forced alignment and loyalism to the United States.
In 2026, the prospect of 500% tariffs looms over global trade, affecting supply chains and government and corporate leadership from Shanghai to Sao Paulo to Caracas. Venezuelan oil, once a symbol of hope for a struggling nation, is now a weapon to control energy prices worldwide. The U.S. is betting big on its ability to sway the global energy market. And at home, the era of cheap dollar store-style goods may be over. Rising prices and empty shelves are becoming the new normal for American families as the events progress. We're at a crossroads, facing choices about our economic future. And many people living their daily lives remain unaware or indifferent. The current administration and its Project 2025 supporters claim that America's use of military and economic strength could restore global leadership. Experts note that even capitalist investors are moving resources abroad. Global divisions may deepen, potentially surpassing domestic polarization between left and right-wing politics. As de-dollarization advances, the world could split into separate zones, including a fortress Eurasia and an isolated America with expanded oil and energy industries, industrial complexes, increased mineral extraction and refinement, and fewer independent allies.
The stakes are immense. The choices made now will echo for decades, shaping the world our children inherit. The U.S. plan relies on military force and coercion. China aids foreign governments with infrastructure and economic deals. Some conservative voices fear this aid could spread communism. If U.S. efforts fail, China and Russia could gain control over governments and minerals needed for advanced technologies. Americans could face higher prices and limited access to smartphones, electric vehicles, and connected industries. Success could create an isolated Russia at least, a reinforced U.S. dollar, and a Western nation or alliance using coercion and force to dominate the global economy. Resentment may grow but remain contained until resources run out. If the population rejects reindustrialization and the oil expansion, and intense climate change patterns continue, whether natural or human-driven, and governments fail to implement available solutions to mitigate human-caused emissions, future crises could worsen, intensified by corporate interests. Today, Ideologics breaks down this complex, daring strategy. We'll explore the motivations, the hidden agendas, and the real-world impacts on everyday people.
We'll examine the pressure points, the risks, and the potential rewards of a nation that leads through might. What will it take to win this new economic Cold War set into motion by the Trump administration? And what might we lose along the way? The story of America's future and our children's place in the world is being written now by extreme conservatives and older generations in boardrooms, in government offices, and in the lives of ordinary people around the world. And it all begins with this audacious idea, the mighty Western fortress. Stay with us as we uncover the forces shaping our future place in the world.
So, what exactly is the Western fortress? It sounds dramatic, almost like something out of a Cold War thriller, but it's very real and shaping the world as we speak. In 2026, the U.S. codified the Western fortress as policy. The strategy passed nonpartisan debate and unilateral action and ratification at the highest levels. Its implementation is already changing global conditions and actions. At its core, it's a three-pronged strategy, each prong designed to reshape America's position in the world and protect its interests in an era of what many elite conservatives and fans see as rising threats. First, intensifying sanctions against Russia to cripple their military funding. On paper, the U.S. appears to be targeting every financial artery, aiming to cut off resources that fuel Russia's war machine while not exactly condemning Putin's administration in full force. It is economic warfare. The goal targets Russia's capacity to project communist power across Europe, the global south, and the northern Arctic.
Second, a resource war with China. The conflict involves control over the minerals and infrastructure of smaller nations, including rare earths and lithium. These resources support technology, from computers and smartphones to fighter jets. The U.S. is trying to break its dependence on China for critical minerals and high-tech components. This means rethinking entire supply chains and investing billions in new industries at home. But will the people accept the grueling industrial work? Or will the robots be put into these factories? And at what expense? The plan requires extreme tariffs and a push for domestic production. The administration calls for the construction of factories. Jobs and careers are shifting under pressure. The government offers limited incentives with no strategy for workers. Elite tech companies predict that robots and AI will replace humans, promoting a future of wealth without work within under 20 years. The situation requires grueling factory labor on U.S. soil by lower-class workers, unless robots fulfill the projected role. It's a direct challenge to China's dominance in global supply chains. The world's biggest economies are now locked in a contest over who supplies what and to whom.
Third, the U.S. aims to secure Venezuela's vast oil reserves and prevent rival powers from establishing influence. Humanitarian reasons remain debated, given the current president's focus on oil. Recent actions include military pressure and control over Venezuelan oil shipments. The U.S. says it is stabilizing Venezuela to secure access to its oil reserves and build an energy bridge for the Western Hemisphere. It's framing the effort as a move to protect energy supplies and prevent hostile powers from controlling regional energy flows. This approach forcibly secures a non-Russian energy source beyond Russian oversight and extends American regional influence and might. It aims to ensure domestic energy access, stabilize domestic sales and use, and maintain economic operations, even if oil supply from the east is disrupted. The pieces are still moving.
The entire concept rests on using America's consumer market as leverage. With the world's largest economy, the U.S. bets it can force companies and countries to make tough choices. It's strategic decoupling, trade with our enemies or trade with us, but not both. The message is clear. Pick a side, because neutrality is no longer an option.
This is the central pillar of the Western fortress concept. America is building walls, physical, economic, and political, to protect itself and its allies, according to conservative and power rules all doctrine. It's a bold, risky move. The stakes are enormous, and the world is watching to see if the gamble pays off or backfires. The world is being forced to pick sides. Old alliances are being tested, and new ones are forming in response to this doctrine. And the consequences will be global and generational. From markets to politics to public sentiment, the Western Fortress Doctrine is reshaping the 21st century in ways we're only beginning to understand.
Let's talk about the real weapon today, the 500% tariff on Russian oil, natural gas, uranium, petroleum, and petrochemical products. It will impose extreme costs on global trade. The threat affects the public, boardrooms, trading floors, and government offices worldwide. When tariffs fail, they shift costs to American consumers and businesses, which in turn aims to encourage domestic manufacturing. Policymakers hope workers will shift from white-collar roles to blue-collar work, as technology leaders promise to complete the development of robots and AI, which they project will generate significant profits and make working an option. So, how is this pressuring the BICS nations? If we exclude Russia, the U.S. strategy aims to cut short the rise of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. Their growth depended on Russian oil and U.S. exports for decades. However, they started moving toward de-dollarization and sourcing alternatives from China and each other. Yet, the U.S. market continues as a cornerstone. Buying Russian oil now could cut access to USA markets and Venezuelan and American oil, posing threats to their economic wealth and rise to power, affecting their industries, employment, and governance, and ultimately, their people.
The ultimatum is brutally simple. Choose cheap adversary communist Russian energy or keep your access to the American capitalist market. There's no middle ground, no room for hedging bets. For countries that rely on both, this is a dilemma with no easy answers. President Trump has approved a Russian sanctions bill that would allow a 500% tariff on countries supporting Moscow. Senators Lindsey Graham, Republican, and Richard Blumenthal, Democrat, have led bipartisan support. Initial reports listed 25 Democrats among 50 original co-sponsors. That number has grown, with some reports noting as many as 85 senators willing to grant the president this authority. The proposed tariff is not currently in effect. Current U.S. tariffs on Indian goods linked to Russian oil purchases are about 50%. If implemented, a 500% tariff would make it nearly impossible to sell products in the U.S. Overnight, foreign goods and produce could become unaffordable, supply chains would halt, and foreign factories would stop production. Effects would reach from New York to Denver to Los Angeles and ripple worldwide as countries adjust to the new policy. It's a bipartisan binary choice enabled by the people's representatives, engineered to fracture any anti-West alliance and the spread of communism. The message is clear: pick a side and live with the consequences.
But is it working? In October 2025, the world observed the Busan rapprochement. The summit marked a turning point as pressure on global powers became evident. China, already facing a 100% tariff and staring down the barrel of an increased percentage, made a move toward compromise. They eased export controls on rare earth minerals, a resource required for global technology and manufacturing. The move indicated that even major powers can yield under pressure.
It was a direct exchange. China relaxed its control over minerals and refining, and in return, the U.S. paused its tariff escalation. Both sides claimed victory, but the underlying reality was clear. The threat worked, at least in the short term. This episode shows that for all their talk of independence, the BICS bloc still requires access to the American market. They cannot exclude the West entirely yet. U.S. pressure forced China to yield first, exposing current leverage limits. Are these limits temporary or permanent? Will China give way first in the next 5, 10, or 20 years? Can a U.S. conservative approach using force and coercion advance its position while advocating to let other nations fend for themselves, withholding aid? Or will China advance through its economic aid, deals, and infrastructure initiatives?
This threat currently has measurable power. It drives policy changes, affects alliances, and forces nations to rethink strategies at least in the short term. Access to the U.S. consumer market remains the largest prize in the global economy. Experts project that the broader Asia-Pacific region will collectively surpass North America as the largest consumer market by 2035. Currently, however, No other market matches the US in scale, spending power, or influence over global supply chains.
The question is how long this fragile truce will last. Both sides monitor each other. Washington typically makes the first move during this administration. Other nations seek alternatives, aware that any misstep could escalate conflict. They currently remain unprepared or unwilling to fully decouple. The pressure is on, and the world's analysts, experts, and regular observers are watching every development. Markets are jittery, leaders are cautious, and ordinary people are often forced to brace for what comes next. The BICS nations are weighing their options carefully, balancing economic needs against political alliances. Every decision is fraught with risk. The next move could reshape global alliances for years to come, setting the stage for a new era of competition or cooperation.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Every negotiation, every handshake, every threat carries enormous weight. Every decision now has global consequences, rippling out to affect economies, industries, and lives everywhere.
The Western fortress is testing the limits of economic power and military force, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in a world that shifted to connection for the past decades. The outcome is far from certain. Uncertainty hangs over markets, governments, and households alike. The world's leaders are holding their breath. The public continues with their wealthy or struggling lives. The ultimatum stands, and the next chapter in this high-stakes standoff is about to be written. And not many people are paying attention or talking about it to their fans across popular podcasts and creators online. The cycle of dopamine addiction via online entertainment has secured its grasp, and it's not letting go.
The strategy aims to direct expectations. The real impact is yet to come, but the message is clear. America is now playing a game of force and might. Venezuela operates as an energy weapon at present. The plan aims to manipulate today's prices and starve adversaries of influence and cash. It's a psychological and economical play. The goal of Venezuelan oil is to maintain domestic supply and keep prices low. The target, $55–60 a barrel, enough to cut into Russia's revenue while ejecting their influence in the global south. So, what's the next step now? The plans appear to be to leverage Venezuelan oil under U.S. influence without exhausting U.S. reserves. By securing Venezuela's reserves and committing to development, the U.S. signals to global energy markets that it's open for business as an alternative to Russian oil. Rebuilding will require billions and years. Industry leaders remain skeptical. The administration has indicated other groups may step in if current leaders are unwilling to take on the challenge. The oil exists, but exporting it while maintaining alignment with U.S. interests will cause challenges as Maduro's regime remains in power and the population faces extortion and repression. The U.S. wants to turn Venezuela's oil industry into a reliable supplier for the Western Hemisphere, the energy bridge. Venezuela's infrastructure is in ruins, and its population suffers as well. The U.S. government wants to rely on capitalism to support the population, while controlling which actors its oil industry can engage. Maduro's administration remains in power. They had indicated willingness to work with the U.S. before, if the U.S. had requested it, until Trump authorized the capture of Maduro. Yet the Venezuelan government remains willing to engage in business following his capture. Now that the U.S. is engaging Maduro's regime in new oil deals, the regime will gain wealth, potentially enabling further socialist programs. U.S. policies blocked Venezuela's socialist initiatives through decades of sanctions and restrictions, and officials often cited the failure of social programs, even though sanctions and restrictions helped drive economic collapse across any Latin nation that attempted socialist movements. The measures targeted government officials, state entities, and Venezuela's oil sector, cutting access to international finance and markets. Sanctions reduced oil revenue and froze assets, sharply lowering foreign exchange earnings and limiting imports of food, medicine, and basic goods. The economy contracted dramatically, with oil output falling from millions of barrels per day to a fraction of prior levels, and GDP shrinking substantially. loss of oil revenue, and restricted trade contributed to a steep drop in living standards and deep shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods in Venezuela. Analysts and human rights organizations report that broad sanctions and financial restrictions reduced oil exports and blocked access to hard currency, which limited imports and worsened economic contraction. The resulting collapse in income and supply caused hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and mass emigration. U.S. officials treated these conditions as evidence of socialist failures, creating their own proof to justify fear of communism and socialism. Most Americans remained focused on work and daily entertainment, while Venezuelans concentrated on basic survival. Economic pressure and external sanctions coincide with tighter state control and increased repression in many global South cases. Research shows that sanctions often worsen bureaucratic capacity in developing states, weakening institutions, and reinforcing inequalities during economic crises. States under sanctions sometimes respond by expanding authority and reducing dissent, including through restrictions on civil liberties. Left-leaning leaders frequently encounter corruption challenges while managing sanctions and internal economic stress, and conservative leaders often resist organized left-leaning social policy efforts to maintain favorable relations with Washington. These dynamics can destabilize progress toward equitable social programs and contribute to political violence. In Venezuela, corruption and economic mismanagement eroded state revenues and worsened public services, driving millions to migrate. In the second half of the 20th century, right-wing military dictatorships dominated much of Latin America. During the Cold War, a wave of coups installed military governments in countries. It includes Chile under Pinochet, Argentina's junta period, Uruguay's civic military regime, and long-running rule in Paraguay, among others, frequently with support from the USA and other external capitalist powers seeking to counter leftist socialist movements. These regimes exercised authoritarian control, suspended democratic processes, and suppressed opposition. Historical data shows that most military dictatorships in the region remained as loyalists to the USA or leaned right-wing in ideology and practice during the past decades. For example, these right-wing military regimes often coordinated under Operation Condor, targeting left-wing political opponents across national borders. Declassified documents confirm that the United States provided tacit or direct support for these operations as part of its Cold War strategy, driven by fears of communism and socialism. Left-wing authoritarian regimes were less frequent than right-wing military governments in previous decades. Cuba remains the definitive, long-running case study of the friction between left-wing revolutionary survival and American hemispheric dominance. The 1959 revolution, fueled by legitimate anti-imperialist sentiment born from decades of U.S. economic hegemony and support for the Batista dictatorship, established a one-party state that traded U.S. dependence for Soviet subsidization. Following the Cold War, a regime of intensified U.S. sanctions, most recently the 2025 tourism ban and the quarantine of Venezuelan oil, has combined with the Cuban government's rigid central planning to trigger a systemic poly-crisis. By the standards of liberal democracy, competitive elections, multiple parties, free press, no Cuban leader since 1959 has been democratically elected. However, the Cuban government describes its system as a socialist democracy, which operates on a fundamentally different logic. Most international observers, including Human Rights Watch, the UN, and others, classify Cuba as a dictatorship and authoritarian. The Communist Party of Cuba remains the only legal party. Voters see a single candidate per National Assembly seat with only yes or blank options. The president is chosen indirectly by a party-approved assembly. The President of the United States is not directly elected by popular vote either. Instead, the election is determined by the Electoral College process. In an environment of sanctions, restrictions, global isolation, and internal corruption, a vacuum is created where production fails and the population flees. Cuba is currently enduring its sharpest demographic collapse in history, with nearly 25% of its population having emigrated since 2022. The U.S. executive branch, now led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, routinely cites this state-driven collapse as definitive proof that socialist programs are inherently non-viable. the narrative omits an observable pattern. External economic actions and global isolation restrict socialist experiments from receiving resources or engagement needed to operate or evolve. However, in Cuba, the alternative after the rise of its dictatorial government would have allowed dictatorship to persist alongside emerging Western democracies. Other left-leaning movements, such as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or the early pink tide governments of the late 1990s and early 2000s, often came to power through democratic elections. The United States opposed many of these governments, supporting the Contra War in Nicaragua due to ongoing Cold War concerns about communism. These left-leaning governments did not constitute the widespread, entrenched, military-backed dictatorships that characterized right-wing dominance in the 1970s and 1980s. The general pattern in the mid to late 20th century was that most authoritarian regimes in Latin America were right-wing military juntas, often established through coups and backed by anti-communist USA policies during the Cold War and beyond. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, many of these military governments began to transition to democratic systems, part of a wider regional shift toward elected governments beginning around 1978-1979. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, military rule had largely ended across the region. In contrast, the long-standing continuous authoritarian states that never bowed down to the USA remain in Latin America today: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and are generally classified as left-leaning, socialist or communist-aligned regimes, rather than part of the wave of military dictatorships. Nicaragua's economy has shown some resilience, whereas Cuba, geographically closer to the United States, and Venezuela, much larger, have been facing deeper crises. But these are stories that require their own documentaries, so we digress. Now, the raw materials of the 21st century: lithium, cobalt, rare earths. 2026 is the year of the bottleneck. The US has lithium, but the real problem is refining.
China dominates global refining. Lithium can be extracted in Nevada, but it has little value until processed, and most processing is controlled by China.
The tariff strategy aims to support domestic USA production and refining while applying economic pressure. Revenue from tariffs will fund US refining facilities. The question is whether workers will accept these jobs, whether automation will replace them while passing costs to consumers accustomed to an easy or white-collar life, or whether tech bros and entrepreneurs' AGI ambitions will deliver substantial benefits and wealth to the masses.
The goal, at least in theory, is a closed-loop supply chain within the mighty, all-powerful Western fortress. But building these plants takes years.
For now, we have the raw material, but still depend on China to make it usable.
It's a great vulnerability in the Western fortress plan. The race is on to close the gap with deregulations underway, even as rollbacks of environmental protections weaken safety and health safeguards. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has moved to reconsider or repeal dozens of rules aimed at limiting pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, actions described as historic deregulatory measures. These changes reduce oversight of land, air, and water pollution, and cut environmental justice programs, which experts warn could harm public health and welfare. Research shows that rolling back protections for air quality, toxic pollutants, and emission standards can increase health risks and mortality while weakening long-term environmental resilience without a proper plan for scaling environmental help and emissions mitigation solutions. The outcome will shape America's technological, social, land, and national future. The strategy proceeds with or without bipartisan or lower working-class support. This group constitutes roughly 25% of the population and bears the largest effects of U.S. deregulation policies. Such policies enacted from the 1980s onward received limited working-class support while increasing inequality, job insecurity, consumer costs, and reducing worker protections. Corporations and the wealthy benefited from these policies, despite prior and continued claims of broad economic growth. The new one is AI riches.
In general, there is no majority public demand for broad deregulation among the working class. The political participation of non-wealthy individuals tends to decrease when economic inequality rises, which can further impact whose interests are represented in public policy debates and legislative outcomes. Due to barriers such as less flexible schedules, higher transportation costs, and education barriers, higher-income voters have consistently higher turnout rates than low-income groups according to new census data 2023. Inequality in political participation can make lower-income voters less represented. Time will soon run out to reverse its effects or avoid reaching a point of no return. It could create hardships for reconciliation and generate resentment, as seen already in other nations, citizens' speeches and opinions, regardless of education levels. The stakes are personal for the public now. The world is changing, and so is life at home. The question is, how much pain are we willing to bear? Americans in the lower classes are already feeling the pinch. The cost of this strategy is real and growing. The ripple effects will be felt everywhere. The end of cheap goods could be just the beginning.
Over time, that could weaken the dollar's status and reduce American purchasing power if BRICS nations continue on the path of de-dollarization. The more trade happens outside the dollar, the less global demand for it.
Additional threats appear as BICS nations build alternatives to the U.S. financial system and employ digital currencies and systems to bypass the dollar. The measures increase the chance of inflation and may result in the failure of U.S. force-based strategies if the BRICS plan succeeds.
Full implementation of 500% tariffs will drive U.S. inflation and consumer costs to extreme levels.
The era of easy living will decline as consumers must engage in the reindustrialization and manufacturing process.
Cheap goods may disappear long-term, depending on the speed of Western fortress development if conservative policies continue beyond this administration.
Stockpiles are beginning to decrease.
Companies, particularly small businesses, are struggling to absorb tariff costs.
What does this mean for the average American family? This means a potential future of increased labor unless the promised machines and AGI come forth. White-collar opportunities decline while children take on more industrial and manufacturing work. Blue-collar necessity rises to meet the objectives of technology leaders, who promise automation will shift labor to robot maintenance or that AGI will grant the ability to make work optional. The current administration and conservatives continue to promise riches for all, despite extreme wealth inequality.
This is the beginning of the endgame and a point of no return if allowed to proceed. The chess pieces are on the board. Let's recap the two possible outcomes. If the Western fortress strategy succeeds, Russia is isolated, Venezuela is a stable energy hub, and the US dollar remains dominant.
Brazil and India align with the US, abandoning Russian energy for American markets. The BICS fail to create a dollar alternative.
America reasserts its economic dominance. But what if the strategy fails?
Then we see Fortress Eurasia. The BRICS alliance grows stronger, controls global minerals and oil, and the US is left out to continue its show of force, while shielded in its own isolated fortress.
The Venezuelan project falters. America faces expensive oil and a lack of deals and sales, and the dollar's dominance erodes.
The Western fortress could become an isolated island in a world shifting east.
The stakes are nothing less than the future of global power and national societies.
Two futures, one choice. The world and ideologics wait for the outcome. The outcome is not yet written. All we can do is watch, rise to the occasion, or wait. If the project continues, the Western fortress may maintain American power for years or signal and accelerate the end of US dominance. In chasing the goal to contain Russia and China, the administration and conservative leaders, alongside some Democrats, want to reverse globalization itself. We're living through a defining moment in history. Decisions made this year will define the USA's role in the world as either a pragmatic, indifferent, or coercive nation, or a system guided by ethical, economic, political, and human principles. Politics intersects with a substantial logistical and engineering challenge, offering no guarantees. The cost is real for American consumers. Inflation could be strong, and the technical challenges are enormous. Two very different futures, a renewed American century, or, if the strong-arm approach fails, the dawn of a Eurasian one. Here we are, January 10th, 2026, standing in the middle of that choice. The pieces are moving fast. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, share, and remember, stay aware of history, the present, and how decisions shape systems. Observe who benefits and who bears the costs. Consider the long-term effects on society and the Earth's finite resources. This is the Ideologics team signing out. Godspeed.